Hello again and welcome to the final module, Module 4 of Projex Academy's Scrum 2021 update. And in here, this is the second and final part looking at some of the subtle Scrum changes arising from this update. So let's make a start right away. So the new Scrum Guide now includes minor changes to each of the 5 Scrum events. Let's start with the first then, that of sprint planning. Now previously, the guide listed 2 topics the Scrum team would or should discuss at sprint planning time, and that is what can be delivered in the increment in the upcoming sprint and how such work will be achieved. Fair enough. However, now these 2 topics yield important information that helps the team achieve their sprint goal. However, a Scrum team must also understand why, not previously included. So sprint planning now includes an answer to the question, why is this sprint valuable? And to do this, the product owner proposes how the product could increase its value and utility in the current sprint. And the whole Scrum team then collaborates to define a sprint goal that communicates why the sprint is valuable to stakeholders. And this sprint goal must be finalized prior to the end of sprint planning and before the development work within the sprint actually starts. So that's the new why. And just to clarify, let me go back to what can be delivered in the increment in the upcoming sprint. Again, this discussion with the product owner and the developers would select items from the product backlog to include in the current sprint. The Scrum team may refine these items during this process, which increases understanding and confidence. Going on to select how much work may be completed within a sprint may be difficult. However, the more the developers know about their past performance, velocity for example, their upcoming capacity, their ability to carry out work, and their definition of done, the more confident they will be in their sprint forecasts. And as for how the chosen work will be achieved, here the developers plan the work necessary to create an increment that meets the definition of done. And this is often done by decomposing the product backlog items. Do you remember at the end of Module 3, I gave an example of a product backlog grooming and showing you how many things could happen during the grooming. One of them could be taking large epic stories, if you will, and breaking them down into smaller, more refined user stories. However, all of this is done at the sole discretion of the developers. No outside interference. No one else tells them how to turn product backlog items into increments of value. So Scrum teams who understand the intent of the product owner will deliver better results and higher quality. Referring to the sprint here, of course, the Scrum Guide now explicitly states that only the product owner can abort a sprint. Previously, you knew that it was the product owner that owned the product backlog and he or she alone prioritized the product backlog. Now it's been made clearer that should a sprint need to be aborted, it's only the product owner can do that, inferring of course that the development team can't make that decision. Although of course the product owner may follow advice from the development team in such a situation. Then we come to the daily scrum. I've touched on that already, let me just reinforce that. The purpose of the daily scrum remains the same as I've said. In other words, to inspect progress towards the sprint goal and then go on to adapt and replan the sprint backlog as and if necessary. So what has changed in the Scrum Guide is the method. Gone are those rather simplistic 3 questions that I touched on earlier and replaced with a less prescriptive description. And in addition, the developers can select whatever structure and techniques they want, provided their daily scrum does indeed still focus on progress towards the sprint goal and produces an actionable plan for the next and upcoming day of work. And this provides Scrum teams with the flexibility to use the approach chosen that best works for them, while at the same time still enhancing focus and improving self-management of the team itself. Next we come to the sprint review, the demonstration as it often is. Now it's a venue for the customers, stakeholders and the Scrum team to discuss how they achieved the sprint goal and their progress towards the product goal. In addition, describing what problems have been overcome and what, if any, problems remain in their way. Remember, one of the values of Scrum is transparency. So in Scrum, the work is accomplished by the team, with the sprint review as inclusive as the work itself. You see, the sprint review is no longer led by the product owner, but by the Scrum team as a whole. Remember my early definitions, showing that the Scrum team is now the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the developers. So during the sprint review event, the Scrum team and stakeholders review what was accomplished in the sprint and what has changed in their environment, and then collaborate together on what to do next. Here's our product backlog again. This may also need to be adjusted to meet new opportunities. That would be an example of grooming, as I described in the previous module. So the sprint review is a working session, and the Scrum team should avoid limiting it just to a presentation. In other words, make it as interactive as possible. Bringing us finally to the sprint retrospective. Again, I touched on this in an earlier module. The Scrum Guide now says that the sprint retrospective should focus on two things: respect for people as well as continuous improvement. Retrospective conversations should be open, honest, transparent if you will, and focus on improving processes and interactions. What Scrum is now saying, there are in fact many ways to achieve this. For example, the new Scrum Guide encourages the Scrum Master and the whole Scrum team to be flexible in finding creative ways to solve problems by first finding their root cause. Do you remember the Ishikawa diagram, sometimes called a fishbone diagram, where you have a problem and you lay out the key drivers and give specifics for each? Environment, people, equipment, management, materials and process are the usual ones used. So just for example, the sprint retrospective could almost become a bit of a workshop, a problem-solving workshop. And these solutions may remove impediments or are potential process improvements as identified by the whole Scrum team. And such improvements should be implemented as soon as possible and may be added to the sprint backlog for the next sprint. Yes, do you remember those features prioritised in the sprint backlog? Some of those might be requirements from the users or customers, if you will, but other features needing work on could be fixes to problems or enhancements, and this would be one example of such a situation. The key, however, here is to remain flexible. So there we have it. I hope by now you can see that the Scrum Guide, although updated and tweaked and tightened and defined better in some areas, it still remains the same. Now, I'm assuming that you have already learned of Scrum's 3 roles, 5 events and 3 artifacts by carrying out our Projex Academy Scrum Masterclass. If you haven't, and you've come across these 4 videos without our Scrum Masterclass, here's the link for you: www.projex.com/scrum-master-online-training. Hop on over there and you'll see all the information you need to make a decision on whether you'd like to invest in our Scrum Masterclass. So on behalf of myself, Dave Litton, and all those at Projex Academy, may we wish you good luck in your Scrum Master exam preparation. So until we meet up again, from me, Dave, it's bye for now.